The autumn wind cut through the Virginia countryside in 1817. Tobacco leaves rustle in fields that stretch beyond the horizon, and smoke rises from the chimneys of grand plantation houses. This is the world of American aristocracy, where fortunes are built on land, labor, and the right family name. The Sinclair estate stands like a monument to prosperity. 3 stories of Georgian brick, with windows that catch the morning light like watchful eyes. Carriages bearing the finest families of Virginia roll up the circular drive. Politicians, merchants, and landowners, all eager to curry favor with one of the South's most influential dynasties. Thomas Jefferson once dined in their parlor. Governors sought their counsel. Their tobacco-filled ships bound for London and Amsterdam. The Sinclair name commanded respect from Richmond to Charleston, from the halls of Congress to the drawing rooms of European nobility. But in October of 1817, something changed. Servants began vanishing without notice. Not fleeing, not sold, simply gone. Neighbors reported strange lights flickering in the mansion's basement windows long after midnight. The local pastor refused to take communion at the Sinclair family table, though he would never explain why. By November, even the boldest visitors made excuses to avoid the estate. Whispered conversations died when a Sinclair entered the room. Children were kept indoors after sunset. The postmaster noted that letters addressed to the family began piling up, unclaimed. What transformed one of Virginia's most celebrated families into pariahs? What happened within those brick walls that autumn? And why did a dynasty built over 3 generations crumble in a matter of weeks? The official records speak of business failures and family tragedies. They mention illness, financial ruin, and unfortunate accidents. They do not mention the chamber found beneath the mansion's foundation. They do not describe what the authorities discovered there in December of 1817. Tonight, we uncover what really happened to the Sinclair legacy. A story buried by wealth, influence, and the desperate need of a community to forget. This is Throne of Lies, where royal mythology meets historical reality. For the next 40 minutes, you'll learn why some family names deserve to be forgotten. What you're about to hear has never been told in full. Documents sealed for over 2 centuries. Testimonies suppressed by those in power. Evidence that challenges everything you think you know about America's founding families. The Sinclairs believed their bloodline made them superior to ordinary people. They were wrong. But by the time they realized their mistake, it was far too late. The truth always finds a way to surface, even when it's buried beneath money, status, and 200 years of silence. Thomas Sinclair stepped off a merchant ship in Norfolk, Virginia in the spring of 1751. He carried 2 leather trunks, a letter of introduction to the colonial governor, and enough gold coins to purchase 3,000 acres of prime tobacco land cash, no questions asked. Where does a Scottish immigrant acquire such wealth? The records from his homeland tell us nothing. No inheritance documents, no family estate, no merchant business in his name. Thomas Sinclair appeared in America as if materializing from thin air, yet he possessed the resources of established nobility. Within 18 months, he married Elizabeth Randolph, daughter of one of Virginia's oldest families. The Randolphs had connections to the Colonial Assembly, the Anglican Church, and every major plantation from the James River to the Chesapeake. Thomas chose his bride well. But the marriage was just the beginning. By 1760, the Sinclair holdings stretched across 4 counties. Land purchases that should have taken generations happened in mere years. Neighbors sold to Thomas at prices they couldn't refuse, though some later claimed they never intended to sell at all. Margaret Whitmore's diary, discovered in 1978, describes her father's transaction with Sinclair. Father swore he would never part with grandmother's estate, yet signed the papers as if possessed. The gold Thomas offered was more than we had seen in a lifetime, but father's hands shook as he took it. The Sinclair tobacco became legendary. European buyers paid premium prices, though no one could explain why their leaf was superior to others grown in identical soil. Competitors whispered about Thomas's special methods, but none dared investigate too closely. Political influence followed financial success. Thomas's endorsement could secure election to the House of Burgesses. His opposition meant certain defeat. By 1775, 3 Virginia governors had dined at his table. Continental Congress members sought his financial backing for the revolution. The Sinclair Mansion, completed in 1772, reflected their growing status. Georgian architecture, imported English craftsmen, marble shipped from Italy. But the builders left behind curious details: rooms with no windows, hallways that led nowhere, and a basement far deeper than any wine cellar required. Local craftsmen spoke of strange specifications: underground chambers connected by narrow passages, walls built with hidden compartments. When questioned, Thomas simply stated he valued privacy above all else. By 1780, the Sinclair name commanded respect across 3 states. Thomas had achieved what few immigrants could: acceptance into America's aristocratic class. But acceptance wasn't enough. He wanted to prove his bloodline was superior to those who had initially looked down upon his Scottish origins. Thomas Sinclair died in 1798, leaving his empire to his son Cornelius. The transition should have been smooth, a successful businessman inheriting a thriving enterprise. Instead, it marked the beginning of an obsession that would consume 3 generations. Cornelius possessed his father's intelligence but lacked his restraint. Where Thomas had been content to accumulate wealth quietly, Cornelius demanded recognition of his family's inherent superiority. The genealogical research began immediately. In 1801, Cornelius hired Dr. Edmund Fairfax, a Scottish academic who claimed expertise in clan histories. Fairfax arrived at the plantation with trunks full of ancient documents, heraldic charts, and family trees dating back centuries. The bills tell the story of Cornelius's growing fixation: payments to researchers in Edinburgh, London, and Paris, fees for access to cathedral records, monastery archives, and royal genealogies. Between 1802 and 1810, Cornelius spent more on bloodline research than most Virginia planters earned in a lifetime. The results fed his delusions. Fairfax discovered connections to Scottish nobility, ancient clan leaders, and even distant relations to European royalty. Each revelation required additional research, more documentation, higher fees. But proving noble ancestry wasn't enough. Cornelius became convinced that bloodline determined destiny, that superior breeding created superior people. He began studying what he called genetic inheritance, theories that wouldn't be accepted by science for another century. His library filled with European texts on heredity, breeding, and what he termed bloodline science. He corresponded with researchers across the Atlantic, sharing theories about how noble blood manifested in superior intelligence, character, and even physical health. The obsession affected his business decisions. Cornelius refused to marry anyone without documented noble ancestry. He selected field workers based on their claimed bloodlines. He even chose business partners according to their genealogical credentials rather than their financial capabilities. In 1812, Fairfax introduced Cornelius to the Sinclair Covenant, a collection of documents supposedly proving the family's connection to ancient Scottish rituals of nobility. The papers described ceremonies used by clan leaders to maintain the purity of noble blood and transfer the essence of leadership. Cornelius studied these documents obsessively. He hired European advisors to explain the historical context. He commissioned translations from Latin and Gaelic. The cost exceeded $20,000, enough to purchase an entire plantation. The servants began noticing changes in their master's behavior. Hannah Morrison, a house servant, kept a journal that survived in her family for generations. Master Cornelius speaks of blood as if it were gold. He examines the hands and faces of visitors, making notes in his leather book. The European gentlemen arrive after dark and leave before dawn. Reverend William Patterson, pastor of the local Episcopal Church, grew increasingly uncomfortable with the Sinclair family's requests. His private letters to the bishop describe unholy fascination with ancestry and questions about bloodlines that no Christian should ask. By 1815, neighboring families noticed the changes. The Sinclairs hosted fewer social gatherings. Cornelius spoke constantly about bloodline superiority and genetic destiny. Visitors reported seeing maps in his study marked with locations across Virginia and Maryland properties where families claimed noble ancestry. The servants began disappearing around this time, not fleeing for freedom, as was common among the enslaved population. These were documented disappearances, people who simply weren't seen again. The records show their names removed from plantation rolls without explanation. No sale documents, no transfer papers, just gone. Local authorities received reports but took no action. The Sinclair name still carried too much influence. The family's contributions to churches, schools, and political campaigns ensured their activities remained unexamined. Before we uncover what happened next, consider this. Powerful families have always tried to control which stories survive. The Sinclairs nearly succeeded in burying their crimes forever. If you believe these hidden histories deserve to be told, if you think victims shouldn't be forgotten just because their oppressors had money and status, then subscribe to Throne of Lies right now. We're fighting to reach our first 1,000 subscribers so we can continue exposing the truths that wealth and influence tried to bury. Every subscription helps us hold the powerful accountable, even across centuries. The European advisors arrived in the winter of 1816. 3 men disembarked from a merchant vessel in Charleston, Dr. Magnus Reed from Edinburgh, Professor Henri Dubois from Paris, and a man known only as the archivist whose origins remain unknown. They traveled north to Virginia with trunks of ancient manuscripts and what Cornelius described in his letters as practical knowledge of bloodline preservation. The Sinclair plantation transformed overnight. Construction began on underground chambers beneath the mansion. Workers imported stone from Scotland, claiming it possessed ancestral properties. The basement, already unusually deep, expanded into a network of connected rooms accessible only through hidden passages. Local craftsmen hired for the work reported strange specifications. Circular chambers with raised platforms, channels carved into stone floors, walls lined with what appeared to be ceremonial alcoves. When they asked about the purpose, Cornelius simply stated he was creating a family heritage center. The advisors established residence in the mansion's east wing. Servants observed them conducting what appeared to be lessons, Cornelius taking notes while the Europeans demonstrated procedures using anatomical drawings and ancient texts. The sessions continued deep into the night, accompanied by the sound of chanting in unknown languages. Dr. Reed claimed expertise in Celtic blood science, theories about how noble ancestry manifested in physical characteristics. He examined plantation workers, measuring skull dimensions and documenting eye color, declaring certain individuals possessed markers of ancient nobility. Professor Dubois brought genealogical charts tracing bloodlines across European nobility for 1,000 years. But his real expertise, according to surviving letters, involved practical applications of hereditary knowledge, methods for concentrating noble essence within family lines. The archivist never spoke in the presence of servants. His role appeared to involve interpreting the most ancient documents, scrolls written in Latin, Gaelic, and symbols that local scholars couldn't identify. Cornelius paid him more than the other two combined. The changes in household routine became impossible to ignore. Meals were served at specific times determined by what Cornelius called ancestral calculations. Certain servants were selected for duties based on their supposed bloodlines rather than their experience. The family chapel, previously used for standard Episcopal services, was cleared of Christian symbols and redecorated with Celtic designs. Sarah Wellington, whose family owned the neighboring plantation, documented her growing concerns in letters to her sister in Richmond. The Sinclairs no longer attend church with other families. Cornelius speaks of his blood as if it carries magical properties. His wife Catherine appears frightened of her own husband. The disappearances accelerated in early 1817. James Morrison, the plantation blacksmith, vanished in February. His wife Hannah reported he had been selected for special duties by the European advisors. One morning, his forge was cold and he was simply gone. No note, no explanation, no trace. Mary Thornton, a house servant known for her intelligence and education, disappeared in March. The last anyone saw her, She was being escorted to the basement chambers by Dr. Reed. When questioned, Cornelius claimed she had been relocated to another property, but no transfer documents existed. By April, 8 people had vanished from the plantation. All shared one characteristic: they possessed what the Europeans termed interesting bloodlines, mixed ancestry, connections to tribal leaders, or distant relations to colonial families. Reverend Patterson could no longer ignore what he witnessed during his visits to the plantation. His journal, discovered in the church archives in 1924, describes his final dinner at the Sinclair table. Cornelius spoke openly of blood harvesting and essence concentration. The European guests nodded approvingly. When I expressed Christian objections, they dismissed my concerns as primitive superstition. I fear for the souls in that household, both victim and perpetrator. Patterson wrote to Virginia authorities in May 1817, describing his concerns about ungodly practices and requesting investigation. The letter was filed without response. A follow-up inquiry in June received a brief reply stating the Sinclair family was under no suspicion of wrongdoing. The influence of wealth and political connections created a protective barrier around the plantation. Sheriff Thomas Bradley had received substantial contributions to his election campaign from Cornelius. Judge William Morrison, James Morrison's distant cousin, owned land purchased from the Sinclairs at favorable terms. The network of obligation and financial dependence ensured official silence. Even neighboring families, despite their growing fears, hesitated to take direct action. The Sinclairs still controlled shipping routes for tobacco export. They held mortgages on several surrounding plantations. A single word from Cornelius could destroy a family's financial future. Fear of economic retaliation kept potential witnesses silent. But the European advisors grew impatient with gradual progress. Letters from Dr. Reed to contacts in Edinburgh, intercepted years later by authorities, reveal the timeline they established. American customs require delicate handling, but our research demands acceleration. The autumn ceremonies cannot be delayed further. Cornelius understands the necessity. By September 1817, the preparations were complete. The underground chambers had been finished. The selected subjects had been identified. The ancient manuscripts had been studied and interpreted. Everything was ready for what the documents called the Great Working, a ritual the advisors claimed would permanently establish the Sinclair bloodline's superiority. What happened in those basement chambers would shock a nation and destroy a dynasty forever. The economic collapse began in August. Tobacco prices plummeted across Virginia as European buyers shifted to cheaper Carolina leaf. 3 major shipping contracts were canceled within a week. The Sinclair warehouses, once bustling with activity, stood nearly empty by September. Cornelius watched 2 generations of wealth evaporate. Creditors demanded payment on loans secured by plantation property. Workers' wages fell months behind. The grand lifestyle that had defined the Sinclair name teetered on the edge of ruin. But Cornelius refused to accept ordinary financial failure. In his mind, the family's blood made them destined for greatness. Economic setbacks were temporary obstacles that superior breeding would overcome. The European advisors assured him their research offered a solution, if he possessed the courage to implement their findings. The final advisor arrived on September 10th. Brother Malcolm MacLeod stepped off the morning coach from Richmond, carrying credentials from Edinburgh's most exclusive occult societies. Unlike the previous advisors who maintained academic pretenses, MacLeod openly discussed what he called blood transference ceremonies, rituals designed to concentrate noble essence within chosen bloodlines. MacLeod brought with him the Sinclair Covenant's final chapter instructions for conducting what the documents termed the elevation ritual. The ceremony would allegedly transfer the hereditary strength of multiple bloodlines into a single family, ensuring permanent dominance over lesser mortals. The ritual required specific components. First, blood from individuals possessing documented noble ancestry. The European advisors had already identified suitable subjects among the plantation's workers and neighboring families. Each victim would contribute what MacLeod called ancestral essence to strengthen the Sinclair bloodline. Second, the ceremony needed to occur during the autumn equinox when, according to Celtic tradition, the boundary between worlds grew thin. September 23rd provided the optimal celestial conditions. Third, and most critically, the ritual demanded willing participation from a blood relative whose ancestry was beyond question. Someone whose noble lineage could anchor the ceremony's power. Margaret Sinclair Bradford, Cornelius's cousin from Maryland, provided the perfect solution. Margaret descended from both Scottish nobility and colonial Virginia's founding families. Her bloodline included connections to English earls, Scottish clan leaders, and 3 signers of the Declaration of Independence. When Cornelius invited her for an extended autumn visit, she accepted without suspicion. The underground chambers were prepared with meticulous attention to ancient specifications. The central room contained a raised stone platform surrounded by carved channels designed to collect and direct blood flow. Celtic symbols covered the walls, spirals, crosses, and clan markings copied from the most sacred Scottish manuscripts. Candles made from specific materials illuminated the space. Beeswax mixed with herbs imported from Scotland, wicks woven from linen blessed by Edinburgh's occult societies. The smell, according to later testimony, was unlike anything in the natural world, sweet, metallic, and somehow ancient. MacLeod supervised the arrangement of ceremonial implements. Silver chalices for collecting blood, knives forged from Scottish iron, bowls carved from stone quarried near ancient clan burial sites. Every detail followed instructions preserved in documents older than Christianity. The victims were selected and prepared. 7 individuals were chosen for their bloodline characteristics. 3 house servants with documented connections to tribal nobility, 2 field workers descended from colonial families, a local craftsman whose grandmother claimed Scottish heritage, and Margaret herself, the crown jewel whose willing participation would anchor the entire ceremony. The European advisors explained the process to Cornelius in clinical terms. Each victim would contribute blood according to specific measurements. The ceremony would concentrate their hereditary essence into chalices, which Cornelius would consume while reciting incantations designed to transfer their genetic superiority into his own bloodline. The ritual would make him permanently superior to ordinary humans. September 23rd arrived with an unseasonable cold. Margaret had been staying at the plantation for 10 days, unaware of her intended role in the ceremony. The advisors convinced her to participate by claiming the ritual was a harmless Scottish blessing, a way to honor her Celtic ancestry and strengthen family bonds. The other victims received no such deception. They were brought to the basement chambers against their will, restrained with ropes, and forced onto stone platforms while MacLeod explained their purpose. They would die so that noble blood could achieve its destined supremacy. Their sacrifice would elevate a superior bloodline to its rightful place above common humanity. Hannah Morrison, the blacksmith's wife, survived to provide testimony years later. Her account, recorded by Virginia authorities in 1820, describes the night in horrific detail. Master Cornelius stood at the altar wearing robes covered in strange symbols. The European men chanted in languages I had never heard. They told us our blood would make the Sinclair family immortal, that we should feel honored to serve such a noble purpose. The ceremony began at midnight. MacLeod performed the initial invocations, calling upon Celtic gods and clan spirits to witness the ritual. Cornelius repeated phrases in Gaelic, promising eternal loyalty to ancestral forces in exchange for permanent bloodline enhancement. The first victim was brought forward, Thomas Green, a craftsman whose grandmother had emigrated from Scotland. MacLeod used a ceremonial knife to make precise incisions, collecting blood in silver chalices while chanting what he claimed were ancient formulas for essence extraction. But something went wrong. Thomas Green fought against his restraints with unexpected strength. The carefully measured blood collection became chaotic. Green's struggles contaminated the ceremonial chalices, ruining what MacLeod described as delicate alchemical processes. The ritual's precision collapsed into violence. Cornelius, desperate to salvage the ceremony, began making random cuts on multiple victims simultaneously. Blood flowed across the stone platform in uncontrolled torrents. The European advisors argued among themselves about proper procedures while their victim screamed and struggled. Margaret finally understood what was happening. Her cousin intended to murder her along with 7 other people in pursuit of supernatural power. She broke free from the ceremonial restraints and ran toward the chamber's exit, screaming for help that would never come. Cornelius pursued her with the ceremonial knife. In his mind, the ritual's success depended entirely on Margaret's willing participation. Without her noble blood anchoring the ceremony, months of preparation would be wasted. He caught her at the chamber entrance and attempted to force her back to the altar. The struggle became a slaughter. Cornelius stabbed Margaret repeatedly, no longer following ritual procedures but simply trying to collect her blood before she died. The other victims, seeing their fate clearly, fought against their restraints with desperate energy. The European advisors abandoned all pretense of ceremony. Dr. Reed grabbed a knife and began killing victims as quickly as possible, hoping to salvage some hereditary essence from the chaos. Professor Du Bois attempted to collect blood from multiple sources simultaneously, mixing bloodlines that the ritual demanded be kept separate. MacLeod tried to maintain the incantations, but his chanting became frantic shouting as the chamber filled with screams, blood, and the smell of approaching death. Hannah Morrison managed to break free during the confusion. She ran through the underground passages, covered in blood, searching for an exit. Behind her, she could hear Cornelius howling like an animal as he realized his family's destiny was slipping away with each drop of spilled blood. The ritual had failed completely. Instead of transferring noble essence, the ceremony produced only carnage. 6 people lay dead or dying on the stone platform. Margaret's blood mixed with that of servants and craftsmen, creating exactly the contamination the ancient texts warned would destroy any supernatural benefits. Cornelius suffered what witnesses described as a complete mental collapse. He stood in the blood-soaked chamber, clutching Margaret's body, repeating Gaelic phrases that no longer seemed to have meaning. The European advisors gathered their documents and prepared to flee, abandoning their American patron to face the consequences alone. The cover-up began immediately. Catherine Sinclair, awakened by screams from the basement, discovered the scene of horror below her home. Rather than summon authorities, she sent servants to fetch family lawyer Benjamin Curtis and plantation overseer William Thompson. Curtis took charge of damage control. The bodies were moved to a storage building and covered with lime to accelerate decomposition. The basement chamber was scrubbed clean and sealed with fresh masonry. Servants who had witnessed any part of the night's events were sworn to secrecy under threat of immediate execution. Money changed hands across Virginia. Sheriff Bradley received a payment equivalent to 5 years' salary with instructions to delay any investigation. Judge Morrison was offered forgiveness of substantial debts in exchange for his discretion. Even Reverend Patterson was approached with a generous donation to his church building fund. The official story blamed Margaret's death on a riding accident. The missing servants were explained as runaways who had fled during the confusion of a tragic family emergency. The European advisors had returned to their homeland after completing their genealogical research. But Hannah Morrison had escaped. She reached a neighboring plantation before dawn, covered in blood and speaking of ritual murder in the Sinclair basement. Her testimony provided the first evidence that money and influence couldn't suppress. What you're hearing isn't in any history textbook. The Sinclair family tried to bury these horrors forever, and they nearly succeeded. Official records were altered, witnesses were silenced, evidence was destroyed. If you think these stories deserve to be told, if you believe victims like Margaret Bradford and Thomas Green deserve to be remembered, please subscribe to Throne of Lies right now. We're fighting to hit 1,000 subscribers so we can bring you more untold histories that powerful families tried to erase. Don't let wealth and influence win by staying silent. Hannah Morrison's testimony reached Richmond on October 15, 1817. Governor James Preston received a detailed letter from Reverend Patterson describing ritual murder at the Sinclair plantation. Unlike local authorities who could be bought or intimidated, Preston answered directly to federal oversight and Virginia's reputation in the expanding Union. The governor dispatched State Marshal William Hayes with orders to investigate immediately. Hayes arrived at the Sinclair plantation on October 20th with federal authority that superseded local jurisdiction. Sheriff Bradley's attempts to delay the investigation were overruled. Judge Morrison's protests about unsubstantiated accusations were ignored. The evidence spoke for itself. The basement chamber, despite attempts to seal it, still reeked of death. Limestone walls showed stains that no amount of scrubbing could remove. The ceremonial platform contained grooves carved specifically for blood collection, architectural features that served no innocent purpose. Hidden behind false walls, investigators discovered the European advisor's documents. Celtic manuscripts describing blood rituals. Genealogical charts marking suitable subjects for ceremony. Correspondence with Edinburgh's occult societies detailing American experiments in bloodline enhancement. Most damning were Cornelius's own records. His journal documented months of preparation, payments to the European advisors, and detailed plans for the elevation ritual. Entries from September 23rd described the ceremony's failure in his own handwriting. Margaret's resistance contaminated the sacred blood. The lesser subjects fought against their destiny. Our bloodline's ascension has been delayed, not defeated. The physical evidence was overwhelming. Investigators found remains buried in shallow graves across the plantation. 6 bodies showing evidence of ceremonial knife wounds. Margaret Bradford's jewelry hidden in Cornelius's personal quarters. Blood-stained robes embroidered with Celtic symbols. Federal marshals arrested Cornelius on November 2nd. His mental state had deteriorated dramatically since the ritual's failure. He spoke constantly about completing the ceremony, claiming the dead victims were still providing hereditary essence to strengthen his bloodline. When questioned about Margaret's death, he insisted she had willingly sacrificed herself for the family's supernatural elevation. The trial began in Richmond on January 14, 1818. Federal prosecutors presented evidence that shocked even experienced court observers. Hannah Morrison's testimony provided eyewitness accounts of ritual murder. Dr. Edmund Fairfax, captured while attempting to flee to Scotland, testified about the family's obsession with bloodline superiority in exchange for clemency. Cornelius's defense attorney argued temporary insanity caused by financial pressure and foreign manipulation. The European advisors, he claimed, had exploited a desperate man's grief over his family's declining fortune. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Cornelius Sinclair was convicted of 6 counts of premeditated murder and sentenced to death by hanging. The verdict was read on February 28, 1818, exactly 5 months after the ritual that destroyed his family. But Cornelius would not face the gallows. He died in his Richmond jail cell on March 15th, apparently from self-inflicted wounds using a piece of broken pottery. His final words, according to guards, were Celtic phrases about rejoining his ancestors in the realm of noble blood. The Sinclair Empire collapsed with stunning speed. Federal authorities seized the plantation under laws governing criminal enterprises. Outstanding debts were called in simultaneously, as creditors rushed to recover funds before the family's assets disappeared entirely. The tobacco warehouses were sold at auction for a fraction of their value. The mansion's furnishings went to Richmond dealers who asked no questions about their origins. Even the plantation's livestock was liquidated to satisfy creditor claims. Catherine Sinclair fled to her family's estate in South Carolina, taking only what jewelry and portable wealth she could carry. Her children were sent to relatives in Georgia with instructions never to use the Sinclair name publicly. Other family members scattered across the expanding frontier. Thomas Sinclair Jr., Cornelius's younger brother, changed his name to Thomas Sterling and established a modest farm in Tennessee. Margaret's surviving relatives petitioned the Maryland courts to officially disassociate their bloodline from the Sinclair heritage. The neighboring community struggled with their own complicity. Families who had remained silent during months of disappearances faced difficult questions about their moral failure. Sheriff Bradley resigned in disgrace. Judge Morrison lost his next election by the largest margin in county history. Churches held special services seeking forgiveness for their failure to protect the innocent. Reverend Patterson dedicated his remaining years to documenting the victims' stories, ensuring their names would not be forgotten along with their murderers. But the surviving Sinclairs refused to accept historical judgment. Catherine hired Richmond lawyer Marcus Webb to manage what she called reputation restoration. Webb's job involved rewriting the family's narrative, transforming ritual murderers into tragic victims of foreign manipulation. The campaign began with systematic document destruction. Webb purchased and burned genealogical records connecting the family to Scottish occultism. He bought back correspondence with European advisors from private collectors. Court documents were lost through bribes to clerks and archivists. Local historians received generous payments to modify their accounts. Professor Samuel Morrison of William and Mary College published a revised history in 1825 describing Cornelius as a distinguished Virginia planter driven to temporary madness by economic hardship and foreign influence. Margaret Bradford became a beloved cousin who died tragically during a period of family crisis. The ritual murder disappeared entirely from official accounts. By 1830, Virginia history books described the Sinclair family's downfall as a cautionary tale about financial speculation and foreign advisors. The victims were forgotten. The basement chamber was filled with concrete and forgotten. Webb's efforts largely succeeded. For over a century, the sanitized version dominated historical records. Genealogical societies listed the Sinclairs among Virginia's distinguished families. Local museums displayed portraits of Thomas and Cornelius without mentioning their crimes. The truth survived only in hidden places. Hannah Morrison's descendants preserved her testimony through oral tradition. Church records maintained victim lists despite official pressure to destroy them. A few honest historians quietly documented the real story in private papers that wouldn't surface until the 1920s. The Sinclair fortune never truly disappeared. Federal investigators seized the plantation and visible assets, but 2 centuries of financial records suggest vast wealth remained hidden. Thomas Sinclair's mysterious Scottish origins provided the template money flowing through channels that official authorities never discovered. Banking records from Richmond, discovered during a 1987 renovation, show substantial gold deposits made under assumed names in the months before Cornelius's arrest. The deposits totaled over $200,000, equivalent to millions in today's currency, and were never claimed or recovered. Property deeds from Tennessee, Georgia, and the Carolinas list Thomas Sterling and Catherine Bradford as purchasers of substantial holdings in 1818 and 1819. These transactions occurred simultaneously with the Sinclair family's supposed financial ruin, suggesting coordinated asset preservation rather than actual loss. Modern genealogical research reveals the family's scattered descendants. The Sterling family of Nashville traces their lineage directly to Thomas Sinclair Jr., though family members refuse to discuss their ancestry publicly. Bradford descendants in Charleston maintain extensive records of their Scottish heritage while omitting any reference to Virginia connections. Most intriguing are the Patterson family of Richmond. Reverend William Patterson, who first exposed the Sinclair crimes, mysteriously acquired substantial property in 1820, 2 years after testifying against Cornelius. His descendants became prominent Virginia lawyers and judges, wielding exactly the kind of influence that originally protected the Sinclairs. Some researchers suggest Patterson accepted payment for his silence about evidence that was never presented in court. The Sinclair story demonstrates how wealth operates beyond legal accountability. Money didn't just buy the family temporary protection, it purchased permanent narrative control. Even after conviction and death, Sinclair resources continued working to reshape historical memory. The process reveals techniques still used by powerful families today. Document destruction eliminates inconvenient evidence. Charitable donations to educational institutions ensure favorable treatment in academic research. Strategic marriages connect scandal-ridden bloodlines to respectable families who have incentives to suppress embarrassing histories. Legal settlements often include non-disclosure agreements that silence victims' descendants for generations. Historical societies receive funding with subtle conditions about which stories deserve preservation and which should be forgotten. The Sinclair case parallels dozens of similar cover-ups throughout American history. The DuPont family's involvement in early 20th century eugenics programs disappeared from most historical accounts through strategic philanthropy and academic influence. The Getty family's wartime activities were similarly sanitized through museum donations and university partnerships. Wealthy families understand that controlling historical narrative requires long-term investment and patience. But the Sinclair legacy extends beyond financial manipulation. Their obsession with bloodline superiority prefigured American eugenics movements that wouldn't peak until the 1920s. Ideas about genetic destiny and hereditary leadership that drove Cornelius to murder became mainstream scientific theory within a century. The basement ritual chamber, sealed and forgotten, was rediscovered during mansion renovations in 1954. The new owners, unaware of the property's history, found Celtic symbols carved into stone walls and ceremonial implements hidden in sealed compartments. Rather than report their discovery, they quietly filled the chamber with concrete and never spoke publicly about what they found. Even today, the truth about elite family crimes faces systematic suppression. Modern descendants possess resources that dwarf their ancestors' wealth. Private foundations fund historical research with implicit expectations about conclusions. Legal teams monitor genealogical websites for unwelcome revelations. The Sinclair story survived only because a few individuals, Hannah Morrison, Reverend Patterson, honest court clerks, refused to let money erase the truth entirely. Their courage reminds us that historical accounts often reflect the interests of those who fund them rather than the experiences of those who lived them. Margaret Bradford, Thomas Green, James Morrison, Mary Thornton, and the other victims deserved better than being forgotten to protect their murderer's reputation. Every sanitized family history conceals similar injustices. Behind the portraits in mansion galleries and the names on university buildings lie stories of exploitation, violence, and the systematic abuse of power. The difference between remembered heroes and forgotten victims often depends entirely on who controlled the narrative after everyone involved was dead. The Sinclair legacy teaches us to question every official account, especially when substantial wealth was involved in its creation. Drive through rural Virginia today, and you'll still find traces of the Sinclair legacy. Sinclair Road winds through what was once the family plantation. The original mansion, now a private residence, displays a historical marker describing it as home to prominent 18th century tobacco merchants. No mention of ritual murder. No reference to the victims buried in unmarked graves across the property. The Sterling family of Nashville, direct descendants of Thomas Sinclair Jr., operates a successful investment firm managing hundreds of millions in assets. Their corporate website features a section on family heritage that traces their ancestry to distinguished Scottish immigrants who helped build early America. The ritual chamber, filled with concrete in 1954, lies beneath a modern kitchen where the current owners prepare family meals. Unaware they're living above a crime scene. Modern family members maintain their silence through legal agreements and financial incentives. When genealogical researchers approach Sterling family representatives with questions about Virginia connections, they receive responses from corporate lawyers rather than family members. Non-disclosure agreements, signed by multiple generations, ensure that family knowledge never becomes public knowledge. Historical societies across Virginia continue receiving anonymous donations with subtle restrictions about which stories deserve telling and which should remain buried. The price of the Sinclair obsession extends far beyond one family's destruction. 7 people died because Cornelius believed his bloodline made him superior to ordinary humans. Their names Margaret Bradford, Thomas Green, James Morrison, Mary Thornton, Samuel Patterson, Elizabeth Moore, and David Whitmore were nearly erased from history to protect their killer's reputation. Hundreds more were terrorized, displaced, or silenced through the systematic abuse of wealth and influence. Local communities learned to ignore obvious crimes when committed by people with sufficient money and social status. The Sinclair case established patterns that wealthy families still follow today. Document destruction, narrative control, strategic philanthropy, legal intimidation. These techniques for escaping accountability have been refined over centuries, but remain fundamentally unchanged. How many other distinguished American families built their fortunes on similar violence? How many historical accounts were purchased rather than researched? How many victims were forgotten to preserve their oppressor's legacy? Every major American fortune includes chapters that money and influence work to erase. The Sinclair story survived only because ordinary people, servants, neighbors, honest officials, refused to let wealth silence truth entirely. Hannah Morrison could have accepted payment for her silence. Reverend Patterson could have avoided controversy by ignoring what he witnessed. They chose truth over comfort, justice over safety. Their courage reminds us that historical narratives often reflect the interests of those who funded them rather than the experiences of those who lived them. The Sinclairs thought their money and status would bury the story forever. For over a century, they were right. But stories like this only survive when people like you care enough to share them. If this investigation opened your eyes to how power really works, if you want to help expose more hidden histories that wealthy families tried to erase, subscribe to Throne of Lies right now. We need 1,000 subscribers to keep bringing you these buried truths. Every subscription helps us hold the powerful accountable, even across centuries. Don't let the elite win by staying silent. Hit that subscribe button and help us reach our goal. Because the victims deserve to be remembered, and the truth deserves to be told. The Sinclair mansion still stands, but their crimes no longer hide in shadows. Margaret Bradford's death wasn't a riding accident. Thomas Green didn't die of natural causes. The 7 victims of September 23, 1817, were murdered by a family that believed wealth made them above human law. Every crown hides a lie. Every dynasty hides its crimes. At Throne of Lies, we make sure the victims are never forgotten, and the truth always finds a way. Power may buy silence for generations, but it cannot purchase truth forever. The Sinclair legacy ends here, not in Scottish castles or American mansions, but in the simple recognition that no bloodline, no matter how noble, no amount of wealth, no matter how vast, justifies the taking of innocent life. Justice delayed is not justice denied. Sometimes it just takes 2 centuries to arrive. Thank you for watching Throne of Lies. Subscribe for more hidden histories, and remember, the most dangerous lies are the ones that powerful families tell about themselves.